It was February of 1879 when a hunter stumbled upon something protruding from the frozen earth outside the decaying town of Millhaven, Pennsylvania. At first, he thought it was a root, dark, stiff, and twisted by the cold. But as he brushed away the snow, what emerged was a human hand, the fingers locked in a desperate claw, frozen mid-scream. The local sheriff arrived by dawn, but the rest of the body was buried too deep beneath the frost. The snow muffled everything that morning, except for the sound of digging. By the time the corpse was uncovered, the town already knew whose land it was found on. The Halloway farm, a place whispered about for decades. When they pulled the corpse out, his eyes were wide open. No rot, no decay, just terror sealed in ice. The coroner wrote that the man had not been dead when he was buried. Beneath his fingernails, packed dirt. Around his throat, bruises. But the worst part came later. When the sheriff tried to question the family, only 2 sons remained in the farmhouse, both pale and trembling, speaking in strange, halting rhythms, as though they had learned language secondhand. The town said they were inbred. Others said they were possessed. But the truth buried beneath that land was far older and far hungrier than either. The Halloway farmhouse stood at the edge of the woods, a place the locals called Black Hollow. It wasn't on any map, and travelers who passed through often spoke of the strange silence there. No birds, no insects, no echo. The land itself seemed to drink sound. Built in 1823, the house had survived lightning, floods, and time, but it had never truly been lived in. Each generation of Halloways grew sicker, quieter, more withdrawn. The line had thinned until only 3 remained by 1879. Elias Halloway, the father, and his 2 sons, Silas and Abel. No one in town remembered their mother. Some said Elias had brought her from the hills. Others whispered she'd been his cousin, hidden in the cellar for years. The boys never went to school. They never went to church. They worked the farm in silence and came to town only once a year to buy salt, flour, and lamp oil. But those who saw them said something was wrong. Their eyes were too similar, their movements too synchronized, like reflections of a single broken mind. The sheriff once tried to speak to Elias about the rumors, but the old man just smiled and said, "You don't question the blood that keeps you alive." That was the last time anyone saw him alive. On the night Elias disappeared, the valley was lit by a strange glow. Several farmers swore they saw lanterns moving in the woods near the Halloway place. Dozens of them, flickering like a funeral procession. No sound, no voices, just light weaving through the trees. When dawn came, Elias was gone. His sons told the neighbors he had gone into the earth, whatever that meant. They said it calmly, almost reverently, like they were repeating a prayer. Days passed, then weeks. The smell began first, a damp, sour rot carried on the wind. Neighbors finally went up to the house. They found the fields unplowed, the animals dead, the windows nailed shut. When the sheriff arrived, Silas and Abel were sitting at the kitchen table, eating nothing, staring into the darkness of the cellar door. "Where's your father?" the sheriff asked. Silas looked up and said, "He's still speaking to us. He's just quieter now." They wouldn't say another word, not even as the sheriff pried open the cellar. What he found below would haunt him until his death, a narrow shaft dug into the earth, lined with candles melted to the bone, leading down to a hollow space no man had ever entered. The stench of soil and something human spilled out. That was when they brought in the shovels. The men who dug that morning said the earth felt wrong. It wasn't cold or hard as it should have been in February. It was soft, damp, almost warm, like something breathing below. The shaft went down 10 feet before the first spade hit wood. When they cleared the soil away, they found a coffin, unmarked, crudely nailed shut, and upside down. Every man hesitated, but the sheriff gave the order. The lid split with a single blow. Inside lay Elias Halloway, but not the way a body should. His face was twisted upward, eyes wide open, mouth frozen mid-scream. His fingernails were torn, blood still fresh beneath them. There were deep scratches on the lid's interior, dozens, layered upon each other like desperate writing. On his chest lay a small wooden carving, crude and old, shaped like an open hand with no fingers. The coroner said Elias had died of asphyxiation, but that he'd been alive for hours after burial. When Silas was shown the body, he did not cry. He only whispered. He found the door again. Abel nodded. Both began humming, a low, wordless tune no one recognized. The sheriff ordered them taken into custody. But before they could leave the property, a tremor shook the ground, and one of the horses screamed until its throat tore. The smell of earth filled the air again, wet, rich, suffocating. Something under the farm had shifted. When the sheriff returned later that week, he searched the farmhouse for clues. In the master bedroom, if it could still be called that, he found a wooden chest under the floorboards. Inside were 3 items: a rusted revolver, a collection of teeth wrapped in linen, and a bound leather journal dated back to 1843. The diary belonged to Elias's father, Nathaniel Halloway, and what it contained was not a record of life, but of devotion. The entry spoke of a covenant beneath the soil, a promise made by the first settlers who had come to Black Hollow in 1791. They had built their homes upon an ancient burial site, and when the harvests failed, they made offerings, not of crops, but of kin. Every generation, one blood must return to the ground, willingly or not. To keep the roots alive, the diary read. To keep the earth from remembering. Nathaniel wrote that he'd buried his own father alive in 1843, and that his son Elias had heard the whisper too. The final entry was dated the night before Nathaniel's death. If I do not do it, the hollow will open and swallow the rest. The sheriff read until his hands trembled. Then he burned the journal. But some pages would not catch fire. They blackened but never turned to ash. Investigators tried to trace the Halloway ancestry, but the records stopped abruptly in 1791, the same year Black Hollow was founded. Every Halloway birth, marriage, and death before that was missing from county archives. Church ledgers had been scrubbed clean, names erased with acid. What remained were whispers, that the Halloways were not settlers at all, but something left over from before the town itself. Neighbors remembered strange details. The sons never seemed to age properly. Elias had been over 60 but still strong enough to haul timber. The boy's skin was almost translucent, veins branching like roots under pale flesh. One midwife swore she'd seen the younger son's tongue fork at the tip when he was born, but she had been found drowned a week later in a creek with no water deep enough to drown in. The townspeople began to avoid the valley. Livestock refused to cross the Halloway fence line. Even plants withered near the property's edge. But when the sheriff ordered the land to be condemned, every man sent to do the job fell ill within days. Fever, coughing earth from their lungs. One by one they died. The last one's final words were, "The dirt moves when you sleep." Silas and Abel Halloway were put on trial in the small courthouse of Millhaven. The press came from Philadelphia, even New York, drawn by the headline, "Sons accused of burying father alive." But the trial never reached its second week. The boys refused to speak except to recite verses that weren't in any Bible, something between prayer and curse. They never denied the act. When the judge asked, "Why would you do this to your own father?" Silas replied, he wouldn't go willingly this time. Doctors were brought to evaluate them. Each one left shaken. One psychiatrist wrote that the brothers did not suffer from delusion. They were utterly convinced that death itself was part of their family's duty. The judge ordered them confined to Havenbrook Asylum, a crumbling institution outside Pittsburgh. They went quietly. Abel turned once at the door and said, "You've buried us all now." That winter, the trial was buried under heavier news: industrial collapse, mine fires, and epidemic. Millhaven faded from the papers. But those who lived near the Halloway farm said the lights still moved through the woods. Lanterns, flickering, like someone searching for a way back to the surface. Havenbrook was a ruin even in 1879, a Gothic carcass of stone built over an abandoned mine shaft. Patients called it the Hollow. Inside its damp walls, the brothers were kept apart, but the staff reported hearing them whispering to each other across the wards, though they were dozens of feet apart. Their words traveled through pipes, vents, even drains. One night, the night nurse found Abel kneeling beside the wall, pressing his ear to the floor, humming the same melody from the farmhouse. His mouth was full of soil. "He's calling from underneath," he said when questioned. "He says the roots are breaking." The next morning, the nurse vanished. Her shoes were found outside her quarters, filled with mud. The asylum's director, Dr. Whitlock, dismissed it as hysteria. But within a month, the foundation began to crack. Dirt seeped through the lower halls. Lamps flickered. Patients claimed to hear a buried heartbeat. Then Silas stopped eating, claiming he was being fed through the floor. By spring, the asylum's east wing collapsed into the mine below. All records from that ward were lost, including both brothers. No bodies recovered. No trace at all. The asylum was closed in 1880 after the asylum collapse. Mill Haven became a ghost town. The soil turned gray. Wells dried. Birds never returned. Those who remained said they could still hear the faint ringing of shovels at night. The town church tried to exorcise the land, but every priest who came reported the same thing: silence that fought back. In 1883, a new family purchased the Halloway property, the Carmichaels. They tore down the farmhouse and built a new home atop its foundation. For 3 years, nothing happened. Then, in the winter of 1886, the Carmichaels' youngest daughter vanished while playing in the yard. Her footprints ended abruptly beside the cellar site. The family left that same week. The town council sealed off the property permanently, calling it unfit for habitation. But by then, Mill Haven itself was already fading from maps. Roads crumbled, bridges rotted, and within a decade, the town ceased to exist. Only one building remained: the church, half sunk into the ground, its steeple leaning like a gravestone. Locals called it the Mouth of God, though no one ever prayed there again. By 1890, the last records of Mill Haven were written by a traveling preacher named Reverend Amos Vail. His journal, found years later in a Pittsburgh archive, described his visit to what was left of the town. He called the church a throat of stone swallowing its own prayers. Inside, the pews had sunk halfway into the dirt. The altar was cracked, and in the center aisle, Vail claimed there was a fissure just wide enough for a man's hand to slip through. When he knelt beside it, he said he heard something moving underneath. Not worms, not rats, something heavier, shifting like wet lungs. He fled before dusk, but not before he noticed a carving etched into the wall beside the pulpit. A hand with no fingers, the same symbol found on Elias Halloway's chest. Vail concluded his entry with a single line: "The earth remembers what we tried to bury." 2 months later, his church in Pittsburgh burned down under mysterious circumstances. His body was never identified. Only his ring, fused into the ash of the pulpit. After that, no one spoke the name Mill Haven again. But those who traveled the old route north claimed that at night, the air grew heavier, and the ground seemed to pulse beneath their feet, like something deep below was still alive, still hungry. In 1903, a survey team sent by the Pennsylvania Geological Society rediscovered the site while mapping old coal veins. Among them was Dr. Howard Keene, a rational man, devoted to science, who laughed at talk of cursed soil. He and his crew set camp near the ruins, unaware they were sleeping above what the old maps had labeled Black Hollow Sink. Keene's first report mentioned strange mineral readings, iron-rich soil that seemed to absorb vibrations. He noted that sound instruments malfunctioned and that compasses spun unpredictably. By the third night, half his crew refused to sleep near the ground. They complained of whispers from beneath the tent. On the 6th night, Keene awoke to find one of his men gone. No tracks, no struggle, just his bedroll, torn open from underneath. The next morning, Keene ordered the site abandoned. But before leaving, he walked into the church ruins alone. His colleagues heard one scream, then silence. His journal was later found in a hollow beam. The last line read, "It isn't buried. We are." Decades passed. Locals avoided the valley, but the few who wandered too close told the same story. The ground there was alive. If you placed your ear to it, you could hear faint movement. If you stayed too long, you'd see the dirt pulse, slow and steady, like a sleeping thing's breath. In 1924, a botanist named Clara Ames collected samples from the region. She reported that roots in the soil grew in spiral patterns, wrapping tightly around each other, almost forming letters. Her assistants found fragments of bone fused into the roots themselves, human, but elongated, like something stretched them. Ames disappeared before she could publish her findings. Her tent was found collapsed, her equipment buried under several inches of wet soil. In her notebook, she had written, "The land doesn't decay here, it remembers." In 1931, a man named Jonas Halloway appeared in Pittsburgh, claiming to be the last surviving descendant of Elias. He was quiet, thin, and oddly formal, as if born out of time. Journalists tracked him down after he donated a large sum to a failing seminary, with one condition: the seminary must build a chapel using stone from the ruins of Millhaven. They accepted. Construction began that spring. Within weeks, several workers fell ill. Some claimed to see movement in the stone, shadows crawling beneath the surface. When asked why he insisted on using that material, Jonas said only, "The foundation must be remembered." He vanished shortly after the chapel was completed. Months later, a caretaker found an old wooden carving on the altar, a hand with no fingers, placed where the Bible should have been. The seminary's chapel opened quietly, without blessing or ceremony. Students who prayed there reported odd acoustics. Their voices echoed back in whispers, repeating words they hadn't said. Some fainted during evening mass, claiming the walls were breathing. In 1933, the dean sealed the chapel indefinitely after a student was found buried up to his chest in the stone floor, alive but unable to move. He survived 3 days, whispering the same phrase until he died. The blood has not forgotten. When the floor was broken open to remove his body, beneath the stone was not dirt, but black roots pulsing like veins. The seminary closed the chapel permanently, bricking the door. The staff refused to speak of it again. By 1937, rumors of the breathing ground reached Washington. Officials from a geological department visited under the guise of land assessment. They recorded radiation spikes, magnetic interference, and unexplained heat signatures. One of them, a man named Dr. Fisk, wrote privately that the ground moves as if it has muscle. The government sealed the report under soil instability research. But the men who went there did not all return. Fisk's body was found later near a creek bed, skin pale, eyes blackened, mouth full of dirt. His last recorded note read, "It knows when you speak its name." In 1948, a student filmmaker from Philadelphia named Thomas Kersey made a short documentary about forgotten towns in rural Pennsylvania. His footage included brief, shaky shots of a sunken church, fog drifting through its broken windows, and something moving behind the altar. The film was never released. Kersey disappeared a week after editing began. The reels were later found in his dorm room, spliced with images that weren't his, faces pressed against glass, eyes white, mouths full of soil. Some frames showed men in 19th century clothing standing in shallow graves, staring at the camera. Others were just black, except for faint breathing. The film was labeled The Hollow Remains. It was confiscated by local police and never seen again. In the 1950s, a handful of farmers who settled near the valley reported strange growths in their crops, corn stalks twisting into human-like forms. They heard voices at dusk, whispering from beneath the furrows. When they plowed too deep, the soil bled a dark, tar-like substance. Local children played a game they called the buried man, daring each other to press their ears to the ground at night. One boy claimed he heard someone say his name. He was found the next morning asleep beside his family's well, standing upright, buried up to his neck. That same year, lightning struck the field and burned everything above ground, but not the soil. It remained untouched, steaming gently under the rain. By 1959, a historian named Martha Layton uncovered fragments of the original Halloway diary, thought destroyed by the sheriff decades before. The legible pages revealed the truth. The covenant was no superstition, it was an act of containment. The settlers had discovered something beneath the valley long before the town existed, a vast network of root-like structures that pulsed and whispered. They believed it was alive, a buried consciousness, older than humanity, feeding on memory and blood. The ritual of burial was a pact. Each generation would return one of their own to feed it, to keep it asleep. The Halloways were not the curse, they were the seal. When Elias refused the ritual in 1879, the sons had obeyed the covenant and buried him alive, to stop it from waking.